Quick question for everyone listening. Does anyone actually remember the Dreamcast? Let's ask a few people about it. After the failure of the CD, 32X, and Saturn, Sega desperately needed a success to keep going in the console race against Nintendo and Sony. Unfortunately, the Dreamcast wasn't it, and the console was discontinued just 3 years after launch. But why is that? Today, I'm going to dive into what the Dreamcast had, what it didn't, how it's viewed differently today, and my personal experiences with it. You're listening to a WJHS Studios production. Welcome to Media in the Making, a podcast where we look at the evolution of media and its changes in all of us, one invention at a time. In this podcast series, we ask, how has different forms of media evolved, and how have these things changed culture? This is Media in the Making, where media and culture are always changing. Now let's take a step back in time. To understand why the Dreamcast needed to be successful, we have to look back at what Sega had made previously. Sega entered the console market with the Master System in 1985, followed by the Genesis in 1989, the CD add-on to the Genesis in 1991, the 32X add-on in 1994, and the Saturn also in 1994. While the Master System wasn't too successful due to the NES dominating the video game market, Sega got their big break with the Genesis, directly competing with the SNES in the early 90s, but failed to evolve as the 90s continued, supporting the Genesis rather than developing a new system. By the mid-90s, the Nintendo 64 had already come out, along with Sony's new console, the PlayStation. By that time, Sega had already released the Saturn, which didn't make much of a dent into the monsters that were Nintendo and Sony. Sega knew they needed to do something to keep in competition, and so, at the lead of Hideki Sato, the Dreamcast began development in 1997. The first thing I think should be mentioned is the launch of the Dreamcast, along with the features the console included. The first thing to mention is that it used CDs just like the PS1, but used the GD-ROM format, which allowed the discs to have 1 GB of data rather than the normal 700 megabytes, making bigger games easier to make for the Dreamcast. Games like Shenmue 1 and 2 were able to use only 4 discs rather than almost 6. It was also the first console to have a built-in modem, making it internet compatible straight out of the box, either for online play or just to access the internet from your Dreamcast. It also happens to be the home of some iconic games such as Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, Shenmue 1 and 2, Soul Calibur, Crazy Taxi, as well as over 600 more games. The Dreamcast well succeeded Sega's sales goals in the beginning, having over 300,000 units pre-ordered and 500,000 sold in the first 2 weeks, with a record 225,132 sold within the first 24 hours. As people have looked back at the Dreamcast, they've seen so much more that was overlooked during its initial production. But even with the upsides that it had, it was a failure for a reason. So now it's time to dive into what problems the Dreamcast had and if they were the console's or the industry's fault. Now, to get to what most people know the Dreamcast for, its failure. First thing to bring up is the downsides to some of the features. Even though it did use GD-ROM, which allowed for larger games, that meant that it had to store more data on the same size disk, making scratching easier and more dangerous. They're also more prone to disk rot, which is when a disk becomes unreadable due to chemical deterioration. The laser as well in the disk drive has been well known to wear out, making it harder to read the disks or simply not reading them at all. The Dreamcast having a built-in modem was cool, but really only in hindsight, as most people didn't end up using it much, due to the internet being in its relative infancy at the time. And while it surpassed Sega's sales expectations in the first month, it eventually dwindled as the console's lifespan continued, and later when the PS2 was released. For comparison, the Dreamcast sold a little over 9 million units, while the GameCube sold about 22 million units, the original Xbox sold 24 million units, and the PS2 sold 160 million units. The Dreamcast never stood a chance, and the two big factors were the lack of DVD support that the Xbox and PS2 had, and lack of third-party support, relying mostly on Sega-published games. There are more issues, but I feel like it would take too long to list them all. When it comes to my personal experience, it's a bit odd. The first voyage I had into the Dreamcast was buying the PS3 re-releases of Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 when I was about 8. Now, I never ended up beating them at the time, but they opened my eyes to a completely different world of semi-retro gaming. I was never a big Sega person growing up, other than liking Sonic. But the more I learned about the Dreamcast, the more I was fascinated by it. It had a nice design, strange-looking controller, and a multitude of great games, most of which I haven't been able to play yet. Not too long ago, I found an old Dreamcast in my basement and cleaned it up. Unfortunately, it's not working at the moment, but I'm trying to get it repaired so that I can play these games on their original hardware. Games like Sonic Adventure, Shenmue, or Illbleed, just to name a few. This has been a bit of a dive into Sega's final console, the Dreamcast. While they're out of the console market, Sega is still a prominent developer and publisher, with stuff like Monkey Ball, Jet Set Radio, Yakuza Like a Dragon, and of course Sonic, just to name a few. Even if you've heard of the Dreamcast 1,000 times, or never, I have one question. Does the Dreamcast interest you? This has been Jacob Rose, and thank you for listening to Media in the Making podcast.